If you want to support me on Patreon, click the element on the end screen.
Hey guys, Tyler here. So, one of the most interesting aspects of the Star Trek universe is its hidden lore, the historical information that permeates the Star Trek timeline and manifests on screen in the form of archaeological discoveries and time travel escapades alike. I've examined several of Star Trek's ancient civilizations in previous videos of mine, but today I want to talk about one of the more iconic races in Star Trek, the Vulcans. I wanted to make a video about Vulcan history, specifically prehistory, for quite a long time, and with some of the recent developments in the franchise regarding this iconic race, I think that the timing is just right. The Vulcans are a race whose recorded history spans thousands of years, much like many of the other major races featured in the show. But their development as a society, and specifically the way that they allegedly came into existence, is quite unique among the various alien civilizations that we meet on screen. From their devastating nuclear exchanges, to the Romulan diaspora, to some possible tampering early in their evolution, Vulcan history is quite the epic story, one that casual fans might not have taken as deep a dive into as I have in doing the research for this video. So, without further ado, let's talk about Star Trek's ancient civilizations, the early Vulcans. Like the other humanoid races in Star Trek's Milky Way galaxy, it is suggested that the Vulcans originally arose from the seeded DNA sequence of an ancient humanoid civilization that lived 4.5 billion years ago. But in terms of what makes Vulcans unique, it's another ancient race that supposedly had a more direct influence. In the original series episode Return to Tomorrow, a landing party of the Enterprise crew interacts with the sole surviving members of an unnamed civilization whose minds have been transferred into spherical receptacles beneath the surface of their homeworld. One of the members of this species, Sargon, proclaims that his people had traveled the stars some 600,000 years ago, and that humans and Vulcans may be among their descendants. Now, astrobiologist Lieutenant Commander Ann Mulhall quickly corrects the record, clarifying that all evidence indicates that humans evolved independently. But Spock chimes in and says that Sargon's claim
would tend, however, to explain certain elements of Vulcan prehistory.
This is a curious remark, one that is not further ruminated upon in the episode as the team deals with the situation at hand. But this tidbit does receive a nod in the Season 1 finale of Star Trek Picard, in which the Romulan Narek theorizes that the apocalyptic story of Ganmadan is not a prophecy, but rather history that possibly predates the arrival of Vulcans on their own planet. Though Ganmadan is a part of Romulan mythology, the Romulans and Vulcans' shared ancestry does mean that their histories are intertwined. The veracity of this Romulan myth is, of course, rather muddied, but the subtle nod towards a more complex story of Vulcanoid origins does lend credence to the idea that their evolution was not as straightforward as might initially seem. Sargon's species is not explicitly named on screen, but script notes for Return to Tomorrow referred to them as the Arretans or the Arretans, coming from the planet Arret. Christopher L. Bennett's novels Watching the Clock, The Buried Age, and Ex Machina refer to them as the Sargonians, a name given to them by Federation archaeologists. The Sargonians are said to have formed a massive empire in the distant past, ruling for 100,000 years. They terraformed and colonized several worlds and mentored a number of junior races. The novels describe their empire as the union of two separate species, the other being an ancestor of the Deltan race, who we are introduced to in the motion picture. As the novels and Return to Tomorrow indicate, the Arret Empire befell a cataclysmic war that stripped Sargon's planet of its atmosphere. This was no ordinary nuclear age, but rather the trappings of a much greater conflict that Sargon says humans could scarcely comprehend. It's not entirely clear if Sargonian settlers on Vulcan are supposed to have acted as a proverbial Adam and Eve, or if the Sargonians introduced mutations into the proto-Vulcan genome, a la the ancient astronaut hypothesis. If there are truly missing links in the Vulcan evolutionary line, then either could be the case. We don't know the full details on whether there were Stone Age Vulcanoid hominids, much like the various hominid cousins of Homo sapiens on Earth. Other sources, such as Star Trek Online, also corroborate the idea that there is debate over the Vulcans' true origins. What is clear, in any case, is that whatever species first evolved on Vulcan, they would have to have dealt with a rather hostile environment. While it's likely that the planet has gone through several climatic shifts and probably once had a lusher climate, for most of Vulcan's recorded history, it's understood that the planet has been covered almost entirely in desert. The 1988 Trek novel Spock's World by Diane Duane suggests that a solar flare from 40 Arretans caused a massive climactic shift early in Vulcan evolution, and if something like this were really to have occurred, that could have provided an opportunity for the Sargonians to introduce some adaptations, such as the inner eyelid, to help early Vulcans better survive. This is entirely speculative, of course, and generally I don't like to rely on ancient aliens type interventions to explain evolutionary gaps, even of fictional races. But as I mentioned in my recent video about the Xindi, Star Trek's track record with accurate portrayals of Darwinian selection is not exemplary. As far as cultural evolution, we are often told in various installments that Vulcans used to be quite barbaric, even by Earth standards. This makes sense in the context of pre-Surak times, as Vulcan emotions are said to be strong. Their passions run even deeper than what we'd expect based on their normal behavior, but their capacity for controlling and suppressing these emotions is even greater. As early as 2700 BC, according to Spock, Vulcans had an aggressive colonizing period. While some Vulcans had begun the practice of suppressing their emotions around this time, for millennia, war and conquest would rage on. They developed space travel by the 9th century BC, according to Enterprise, establishing outposts such as the one on Pajim. They also had fewer encounters with hostile races, as at the time there were fewer warp-capable species. By the 4th century AD, however, Vulcans' rampant emotions and hostile warrior culture threatened to tear their society apart. Atomic weapons, as well as psionic weapons, such as the Stone of Gaul, which amplified violent thoughts into destructive energy, were detonated across the planet. But out of this nuclear exchange came the philosopher Surak, who helped usher in the so-called Time of Awakening, and transformed Vulcan society through his embracing of pure logic. Those who rejected Surak, referred to as those who marched beneath the Raptor's wing, eventually left Vulcan and went on to found the De Bruyne and Romulan civilizations. According to Ambassador Soval, it took nearly 1,500 years for Vulcan society to rebuild itself before they returned to the stars. Their subsequent encounters with species such as the Andorians, the Tellarites, Klingons, and numerous others are referenced throughout Enterprise, and the rest, as they say, is history. It's a story of how a society marked almost exclusively by violent and destructive acts for almost 2.5 millennia was eventually able to overcome its aggression and embrace a more peaceful lifestyle. It's also a story of how the devastation of nuclear war kept Vulcans from returning to space for a period far longer than it took humans to recover from their own World War III. Humans in Star Trek are generally regarded as being on the faster end of the spectrum when it comes to their rate of technological advancement and overall capacity for change, even in the post-capitalist age of the early to mid-22nd century. I think there's an easy explanation for why it took the Vulcans far longer to re-establish themselves. We see throughout the franchise that Vulcan science is sort of peculiar. What I mean by this is Vulcans, who are still, mind you, a religious people, are dogmatic as hell. For instance, not only does T'Pol steadfastly defend the Vulcan Science Directorate's assertion that backwards time travel does not exist, even in the face of countervailing evidence, nay, proof, but even in the 32nd century, as we see in Discovery, the belief among Vulcans that they had caused the burn leads them to suppress the SB-19 data, preventing further research on this post-dilithium form of warp travel. All of this is to say, Vulcan logic is often axiomatically employed in defense of preconceived notions, and challenging viewpoints are often dismissed out of hand without further investigation.
We've already received and reviewed the data around your presentation and found it lacking. I move to dismiss and end this quorum.
In a nutshell, while the Vulcans had Surak, they also could have used a Socrates. This predisposition against certain out-of-the-box lines of thinking probably hinders Vulcan scientific and cultural progression in their post-Surak history, even over 1,000 years in the future. It's this anathema to rapid development that also likely keeps Earth's warp program from taking off, so to speak, earlier than it did. Of course, I should clarify that this doesn't necessarily mean that the Vulcans were physically incapable of leaving their planet immediately after the Time of Awakening, as the offshoot that became the Romulans had to have gotten off-world somehow. Soval's dialogue in Enterprise isn't explicitly clear as to whether Vulcans' nuclear wars set them back technologically, since that might cause a contradiction in canon. But I think that the most straightforward interpretation is that it took the Vulcans 1,500 years to decide that they were ready to rejoin the interstellar stage, just as they believed that humans were too young and impulsive to do the same. So when they took flight again in the 19th century, it's only because that's when they as a society deemed themselves worthy enough to do so. But in the meantime, they would continue to face lingering questions about their identity as a species, questions that would continue to cause cultural divide, even far into the future. Some of the connections made in this video are rather speculative, I'll admit, but I think that based on the explanations and the background information that were given throughout the shows, I think that this perspective on Vulcan history is quite solid. I, of course, welcome any and all disagreement in the comments. Please let me know what you think about the information that I presented in this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, be sure to leave a thumbs up down below and don't forget to share it. It really helps me out quite a bit. If you want to support my content even further, then becoming a patron or a member is a great way to do so. Links to those, as well as my social media and my merch store, are in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe, and don't forget to be awesome. Live long and prosper.